students, our today's lecture is focused on implications of population growth and urbanization for climate change. As we all know that the changing climate is one of the most glaring realities of the present world. Some of the consequences of climate change are melting of glaciers, changing of cropping patterns, spread of many dreadful diseases, rising sea levels that will soon submerge many of the highly urbanized coastal cities of the world, and weather extremes that are experienced by both developing and developed nations. Climate change is not happening for the first time on the earth, rather it has never gained such a serious concern as much as it is gaining nowadays. One of the primary reasons of climate change can be ever expanding population base and increasing incidence of urbanization phenomenon. Therefore, this topic has become a hot theme of discussion. Today, we will also try to analyze the implications of both population growth and urbanization on the climate change. Before understanding the implications, we must understand what population growth is. The population growth rate is the rate at which the number of individuals in a population increases or decreases in a given time period. It measures how population changes over time. Population growth is considered as an important parameter of population dynamics as it indicates how many new children are added every year to the existing population, as it can be seen in insertion 1. Population growth can be of three types. Positive growth, when the population increases between two given points of time. Negative growth, when the population decreases between two given points of time. Zero growth. In this scenario, there is no increase or decrease in the population between the two given periods of time. We must also know about the components of population growth. Insertion 2 shows that there are three main components of population growth: fertility, mortality, and migration. Population growth of any particular place is determined by these three components. An increase or decrease in any of these components can easily bring changes in the population growth. Dear students, after understanding the basic concept of population growth, we will take a look at the status of population growth in the world. The high population base in the present times is a result of positive population growth in the world. Insertion 3 depicts the world population growth rate. Presently, the world population is growing at a rate of 1.18% per year. It means there is an annual addition of 83 million people in the world's population. It will be surprising for you to note that while this population growth rate has slowed down slightly over the last decade, from an annual growth rate of 1.24% in 2005. It is highly unlikely that the growth rate of population will stabilize before the end of the century. According to UNDESA, with a 95% degree of confidence that global population will have risen from 8.4 to 8.6 billion by 2030 and between 9.5 and 13.3 billion by 21st century. It shows that population growth in the world will continue to pose grave challenges to mankind. According to United Nations, the highest population growth is predicted to occur in Africa, which will be having up to half of the population growth between 2015 and 2030. In this way, it is anticipated that Africa will grow by approximately 1.3 billion people. Asia, the largest continent of the world, is likely to be the second highest contributor to future population growth, as it is projected to grow by around 0.9 billion people over the same period. Apart from these two continents, other continents will experience population growth on a much smaller scale. It is also projected that some countries will experience decline in their population. Approximately 48 countries are set to experience a considerable decrease in their population size over the next 35 years. Majority of these countries belong to the developed world. It includes Hungary, Latvia and Japan, where population decrease could reach up to 15% by 2050. Overall, the population of Europe is set to fall at a considerable rate. It will be interesting for you to observe that nearly 33 countries of the world, most of them less developed countries, are set to experience population increases of up to 300% before the turn of the century. At the country level, only a few of the countries will significantly affect the overall trend of population growth. It will include India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, the United Republic of Tanzania, the United States of America, Indonesia and Uganda, that are expected to contribute half of the world population growth between the periods of 2015 to 2015. Thus, the decrease in the population growth of European and some developed countries will insufficiently affect the world growth of population. After the discussion about the population growth rate in the world, we will discuss about the second most challenging reality of the world, which is urbanization. Urbanization refers to the proportion of population living in an urban area. Before 2007, the world was primarily ruralized, but afterwards, more than half of the world's population started living in urban areas. Urbanization kept on progressing with each passing year, and by 2014, approximately 54% of world's population lived in urban areas. It is predicted that by 2050, the scenario of urbanization will be a reverse of global urban-rural population distribution that was observed during mid-20th century. The world's urban population is now close to 3.9 billion and it is expected to reach 6.3 billion in 2050. As it can be observed from insertion 4, presently Asia is home to 53% of the urban population in the world. By mid-century, the urban population of Africa is projected to triple, and in Asia it is estimated to increase by 61%. Thus, it becomes evident that nearly 90% of the increase in the urban population of the world will take place in the urban areas of Africa and Asia only. Insertion 5 shows that at the country level, China and India leads to other nations of the world. China has the largest base of urban population with 758 million urban residents. It is followed by India with 410 million urban inhabitants. These two countries comprise of 30% of the world's urban population. If the urban population of the United States of America, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan and the Russian Federation are added to urban population of China and India, then these 8 countries account for more than half of the world's urban population. The future urban growth is also projected to be witnessed in these countries. China, India and Nigeria are projected to comprise of 37% of the urban increase with nearly 2.5 billion urban population by 2050. At an individual country level, the urban areas are expected to grow by 404 million people in India, 292 million in China and 212 million in Nigeria between 2014 and 2050. Apart from these, 7 other countries viz. The Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, the United Republic of Tanzania, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan and the United States of America are projected to contribute more than 50 million each of the urban population of the world. It is also observed that in a few countries, the urban population will decrease. The largest decline between 2014 and 2050 are projected to happen in Japan, where it will decline by 12 million urban dwellers, and the Russian Federation it is expected to decline by 7 million. Well students, I have introduced you with the concept and status of population growth and urbanization in the world. Now we will look into the implications of population growth and urbanization for climate change. Firstly, we will discuss about the implications of population growth for climate change. It is well observed that large population requires more cultivable land to produce food, and increased economic activity means greater carbon emissions and more intense climate change. A recent study also estimated that by the end of this century, slower population growth could reduce carbon emissions by 40%, significantly slowing the projected rise in average global temperatures. This shows that population growth has a close bond with the increasing carbon emission in the world. The human industrial activity has released vast quantities of greenhouse gases, about 900 billion tons of carbon dioxide, 450 of which have stayed in the atmosphere. About 80% of carbon dioxide emission is caused by industrialization and deforestation. There is strong evidence that the burning of fossil fuels since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution has already caused a 0.750 centigrade temperature rise in global temperature and 22 centimeter rise in sea level during the 20th century. A recent Lancet UCL Commission on Managing the Health Effects of Climate Change identified climate change as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. The problem increases as the fast population growth, which is a result of high fertility, obstructs the path of poverty reduction, which in turn make it difficult task for the achievement of other internationally agreed developmental goals. While fertility has declined throughout the developing countries since the 1970s, most of the least developed countries still have high fertility rates, that is above 5 children, resulting in rapid population growth and high pressure on natural resources, weak infrastructures and ability to adapt the effects of climate change. There is a general agreement that climate change is a human induced rather than a natural phenomenon. However, the principal cause of climate change is high consumption by people in developed countries, where population growth has been low or negative. It is more correct to say that consumers rather than people are the cause of climate change. In other words, climate change is driven more by behavior of the consumers than by the population number. The implications of population growth can be briefed in insertion 6 as firstly, rapid population growth acts together with climate change to deplete key natural resources such as water, fuel and soil fertility. Secondly, rapid population growth can cause a significant increase in demand and often mismanagement of natural resources that are compromised and in decline due to environmental variability and climate change. And thirdly, population growth heightened human vulnerability to climate change in numerous ways and may force people to migrate to areas that are either environmentally marginal or more at risk to the negative impacts of climate change. For example, population growth in Ethiopia is resulting in soil degradation, dwindling land holdings and low agricultural productivity. which increases pressure on poor people to move either to environmentally marginal or urban areas. This makes them more vulnerable and more likely to exploit new resources in an unsustainable way, leading to a vicious cycle of poverty and degradation. A study by Satterthwaite also shows that different contributions of nations to population growth and carbon dioxide emissions from 1980 to 2005. Insertion 7 shows that according to the study, nations classified as low income in 2005 contributed far more to global population growth between 1950 and 2005 than they did to carbon dioxide emission growth. Nations classified as high income in 2005 accounted for far more carbon emission growth than population growth. He observed that population growth can only be a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions if the people that make up this population growth enjoy high levels of consumption and cause significant levels of greenhouse gas emissions per person. Another study by Rusnik also states that over time the temperature change is greater and becomes increasingly sensitive to population growth. In his study, he employed the global change assessment model to estimate the effects of population growth on the global average temperature by the end of the century. He observed that 1% point increase in the average annual rate of population growth between 2005 and 21st century may increase the temperature by an average of 2 degrees Fahrenheit. His results were derived from a relatively high emission base, and he suggested if technology or economics produces a path of lower emission, then the impact of population growth may be correspondingly lessened. Dear students, now we must understand what are the implications of urbanization for climate change. This topic has also received wide attention because according to United Nations report, the world cities are responsible for emission of 70% of harmful greenhouse gases while occupying just 2% land. Since most of the world's growth in population in the next few decades is likely to be in urban areas in low and middle income nations, the link between population growth and carbon emission is much influenced by the implications of urbanization on carbon dioxide emissions in these nations. Thus, it becomes evident that urbanization can be viewed as one of the major reasons causing climate change. It is generally believed that the more urbanized a nation, the higher is the greenhouse gas emissions per person. In his study, Satterthwaite tried to understand the implications of urbanization for climate change. His observations are presented in insertion 8. It shows nations' level of urbanization plotted against per capita greenhouse gas emissions for 2005. The small black diamonds represent low income nations. The small white diamonds, lower middle income nations. The black triangles, upper middle income nations, and the large black squares, high income nations. Most low income nations have less than half of their population in urban areas, and many have less than a quarter, while many have per capita greenhouse gas emission below 0.2 tons, and a few have about 2.5 tons a year. Most lower middle income nations have more than 40% of their population in urban areas, and most of them emit 0.5 tons to 5 tons greenhouse gas emissions per person per year. Most upper middle income nations have more than 60% of their population in urban areas, and their greenhouse gas emission per person per year are mostly within the 3 to 10 tons. While most of the high income nations have more than 60% of their population in urban areas, and their greenhouse gas emissions per person per year is 7 to 15 tons. Of course, a part of the large variations in greenhouse gas emissions per capita between nations with comparable levels of urbanization may be explained by the different criterion which is used to define urban population or urban places. Another study by United Nations Habitat also tried to explain the implications of urbanization for climate change. According to it, a variation lies between urbanization and carbon emission levels in both developed and developing countries. While analyzing the developed world, it is found that in comparison to North American cities, the contribution of urban areas in Europe to climate change is relatively low. It is because European urban areas tend to be more compact. They tend to have lower car ownership, smaller and more fuel efficient cars, reducing emission from private transportation. They have more effective public transportation network. Furthermore, urban areas in Europe have higher levels of densification and lower levels of sprawl in comparison to North American cities. They also took individual studies for knowing the link between urbanization and climate change. According to a study in India, the average greenhouse gas emission of the wealthiest 1% of the Indian population is 4.52 tons carbon dioxide equivalent per annum, or more than 4 times as much as the 1.11 ton carbon dioxide equivalents per annum generated by poorest 38% of the population. Insertion 9 shows some of the findings of the United Nations Habitat report that stated that 69% of the main source of greenhouse gas emissions tend to be urban based and include the combustion of fossil fuels for electricity, cooking, transportation and industrial production. According to this report, in countries relying heavily on coal for electricity, it can be the single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. This was supported by a study of 15 South African cities, which indicated that generation of electricity was responsible for more than 100 million tons of carbon dioxide emission annually, or 66% of the total. Globally, transportation is also responsible for about 23% of total energy related greenhouse gas emissions and 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. There are currently nearly 1.2 billion passenger vehicles worldwide. By 2050, this figure is projected to reach 2.6 billion, the majority of which will be found in developing countries. The report warns that as economies grow, transport activities increase and are expected to continue increasingly in the decades ahead, especially with increasing levels of urbanization, notably in rapidly expanding economies such as China, India and Latin America. Around 19% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with industrial activities. A study on Shanghai observed that between 1990 and 2005, 90% of the energy was consumed by the industrial sector. The direct greenhouse gas emissions from industries in the city like Los Angeles, Paraguay and Toronto at 0.22, 0.43 and 0.57 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita per income respectively. The report also quoted IPCC estimates that show global emissions for residential and commercial buildings at 10.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, or 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In the United Kingdom, residential buildings are responsible for 26% of all carbon emission, commercial and public buildings for 13% and industrial buildings for 5%. In China, energy consumption of buildings accounts for 28% of national energy consumption and contributes 25% of national greenhouse gas emissions. The study also stated that emission from waste represent about 3% of total emissions. Despite being only a small contributor to global emissions, rates of waste generation have been increasing in recent years, particularly in developing countries that have been experiencing increasing affluence. Thus, it can be concluded from our discussion that both population growth and urbanization have negative implications for the climate change. At the global level, population growth rate is on decline, but still there is an annual addition of 83 million people in the world's population. At the continent level, Africa and Asia are predicted to experience high growth rates of population. Not only population growth, but high urbanization is also projected to be witnessed in both of these continents. It is well recognized that the high population growth rate and the high urbanization rate lays a strong impact on the resilience of the nations, and it is a matter of concern that both these continents have a majority of the developing or least developed countries of the world, which lack effective mechanism to tackle with the threats posed by climate change. Thank you.